This fall, the Supreme Court will decide whether or not to take up a case that could lead to the downfall of same-sex marriage rights in multiple states. And when I say multiple states, I mean most states. And if they agree to hear this case, it'll be on the docket for the next term. And if they rule in the way that we all expect them to, that means that same-sex marriages could be banned in your state by this time next year. Is this a guarantee? No, it's not. But is there cause for concern? Absolutely. So I'm going to talk about the details of this potential case and what it would mean for same-sex couples going forward if the Supreme Court does the unthinkable. So the case that they're being asked to take up is the case from Kim Davis, the thrice-divorced defender of marriage who was jailed and fined for not issuing marriage licenses to same-sex couples in Rowan County, Kentucky, even though she was obligated to do so as county clerk in 2015 after the Supreme Court struck down bans on same-sex marriages. Now, she claims that the Supreme Court's decision to overturn bans on gay marriages violated her religious liberty, but as a public official, she wasn't being asked to officiate gay weddings or endorse them or wish them congratulations. She was simply being asked to do her fucking job and follow the law. Public officials cannot cite their religion as a justification to deny marriage licenses to interracial or interfaith couples. And an atheist couldn't deny marriage licenses to Christian couples if he or she was a county clerk. As county clerk, your job is to follow the law. Kim Davis did not do that. And she thinks that she's a victim because she was punished for breaking the law, and she thinks that there should be special rights, a carve-out for homophobic public officials like her. But she's not just asking to let religious public officials discriminate against same-sex couples in this case. She is explicitly asking the Supreme Court to overturn Obergell v. Hodges, which is the first time that this has been asked of the Supreme Court since Obergell in 2015. And for those who don't know, Obergell is the decision that struck down bans on same-sex marriages in all 50 states. It was a monumental case. And the reason why this particular case involving Kim Davis is so important is because she is in a unique position to actually get this done, since she does indeed have standing. Think about it. So a regular Christian who wants to overturn gay marriage, they have no standing. Like, you can't just say, I don't like it, therefore it should be banned. Like, you have to demonstrate harm because of a particular thing. And the only Christian in the country who can say that they've been harmed by same-sex marriages is Kim Davis. She can actually say, yes, I've been negatively affected by the prohibition on gay marriages. You know, it's true. She did it to herself. It's not our fault that she chose to be a bigot and break the law. Nonetheless, you can see why a court would agree that she has standing. So I've also got to point out that her timing here is impeccable, because if you're opposed to marriage equality, then now is the time to strike for a number of reasons. First and foremost, public polling from Gallup shows that support for marriage equality has declined overall, including among Democrats temporarily before rebounding in 2025. But among Republicans, support has plummeted by 14 points since its peak in 2022, when marriage equality had majority support even among Republicans. Now, a second reason why this is the time to strike is because there's been a renewed legislative push to ban marriage equality at the state level. ABC News reports, so far in 2025, at least 9 states either introduced legislation aimed at blocking new marriage licenses for LGBTQ plus people, or they've passed resolutions urging the Supreme Court to reverse Obergell at the earliest opportunity, according to the advocacy group Lambda Legal. On top of that, Trump's judicial appointments are fundamentalist extremists with a history of open bigotry towards queer people, and they've ominously played coy whenever Obergell comes up during their confirmation hearings, which means that they're against it. I mean, when Amy Coney Barrett and Kavanaugh were asked about Roe v. Wade during their confirmation hearings, they would simply say that's established precedent, and they would imply that they wouldn't strike it down. But here, these potential confirmations aren't even pretending that they wouldn't strike down Obergell. And this, to me, is an indication that the broader legal landscape in this country is shifting on this issue. So as much as it pains me to admit this, I think that the anti-marriage equality bigots have a lot of momentum on their side, the most that they've had certainly in a decade. And Davis is asking the Supreme Court to treat Obergell in the same way that the court treated Roe, by returning this issue to the states. And her legal team gave a wink and a nod to the concurring opinion in Dobbs, written by Clarence Thomas, where he notoriously said that the court should reconsider Griswold, Obergell, and even Lawrence v. Texas. Now, for those who don't know, Griswold established the right to privacy, which created a penumbra of rights that led to the right to abortion, contraception, and even Loving v. Virginia, which established interracial marriage rights, which is how Clarence Thomas was able to get married to his disgusting insurrectionist hog wife, Ginny Thomas. And it also led to the legalization of homosexuality, which was still illegal in some states up until 2003. But Thomas said, no, let's go back. Let's revisit all of these cases because, the foundation was pulled apart with the Dobbs decision. And now he realizes we can revisit the precedent for the other cases that built upon the precedent established in Roe. So the question is, do the other conservative justices want to do the same thing? Do they want to follow Clarence Thomas down this path? And ABC News reports, quote, Justices Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett seem wildly uninterested. Maybe Justice Neil Gorsuch, too, said Sarah Isgur, an ABC News legal analyst and host of the legal podcast Advisory Opinions. There is no world in which the court takes the case as a straight gay marriage case, Isgur added. It would have to come up as a lower court holding that Obergell binds judges to accept some other kind of non-traditional marital arrangement. Now, I don't know if I'm as optimistic as she is, but what she's saying is important because she's saying if the court chooses to hear Kim Davis's case, then they could potentially sidestep her request to overturn the precedent set by Obergell and just rule on the fundamentals of her specific case. It's also important to note that she did previously petition the Supreme Court for a writ of certiorari before, and they rejected it. They shot her down. ABC News continues, Davis first appealed the Supreme Court in 2019, seeking to have the damages suit against her tossed out, but her petition was rejected. Conservative Justices Thomas and Samuel Alito concurred with the decision at the time. Quote, this petition implicates important questions about the scope of our decision in Obergell, but it does not cleanly present them, Thomas wrote in a statement. So that's some cause for optimism, at least, if we're looking at the silver lining. But again, the Supreme Court, their legitimacy is at an all-time low. So why not? If you're Clarence Thomas and you want to overturn same-sex marriage, but not interracial marriage, of course, why wouldn't you do it right now? You strike while the iron is hot. And if they don't take up this opportunity, then they might not be able to do it again. So, on one hand, if they don't take this up, then maybe this issue is settled, at least for a while. But if they do, then that's a different fucking story, right? Now, also, Kim Davis is applying for writ based on an entirely different question. Now she is asking them explicitly to revisit the merits of their Obergell decision, which would be much more enticing to somebody like Thomas and Alito, who would love the chance to strike down same-sex marriages, but don't necessarily give a shit about Kim Davis herself. Now, Davis has kind of fine-tuned her legal argument and cited Roberts, who dissented in Obergell, and she's arguing that marriage equality should be overturned because at the time, the Chief Justice himself argued that same-sex marriages posed a threat to religious liberty, and she's saying, I'm proof that was indeed the case. He's right. Therefore, you should strike it down. So we don't know if they're going to take up the case. All we can do is guess. But if you see the headlines this fall that the Supreme Court is taking up a case on marriage equality, that's your warning that there is a very high chance that Obergell will be struck down by a 5-4 decision at the very least. It's probably going to be 6-3, but 5-4 at a minimum. The question is, what happens to gay couples who are already married? Do we lose our marriages? Well, as Axios reports, more than 24 U.S. states have trigger laws that would limit marriage equality if the Supreme Court overturned its legalization of gay marriage. 32 states have constitutional and or legislative bans on marriage equality, currently unenforceable because of the 2015 Supreme Court ruling. This means about 60% of LGBTQ plus adults live in states where access to marriage equality would change if Obergell were struck down, according to the Movement Advancement Project. And as you can see from this map, a strong majority of states would indeed start denying licenses to same-sex couples again if Obergell was struck down, an exception being Oregon, because in 2014, our state Supreme Court determined that our constitutional ban on same-sex marriage conflicted with the U.S. Constitution. So I'm assuming that the law would just revert back to the 2014 ruling where the constitutional ban on marriage equality couldn't be enforced. But even if that's the case, they should still repeal this from the Constitution because it's kind of a fuck you to taxpaying Oregonians to have our Constitution tell us that our marriages aren't valid, even if they can enforce that. That amendment, by the way, was adopted by a ballot initiative back in 2004, before I was even old enough to vote, and our governor is a married gay woman. So I'm not necessarily too concerned about Oregonians because I think that our rights are going to be protected, but who I'm really concerned about are the gay couples in red states, because going forward, if Obergell is overturned, same-sex couples in these states will not be able to get married in their states. But there is one major catch. So since Biden signed the Respect for Marriage Act into law, it would protect all existing same-sex marriages. And even if you live in a state that doesn't issue licenses to same-sex couples, well, you can go get married in a different state and come back to your home state, and they're still required to recognize your marriage because of the Respect for Marriage Act. So this means that even if the Supreme Court does the unthinkable and overturns Obergell, your marriage will be protected. But if you're not already married, you could subvert your state's ban by traveling to a different state in the same way that women are subverting state abortion bans by traveling to different states. Should you have to do that? No, because that's completely unfair. It's a constitutional right, and that's a really far trip if you're in the deep south, and you'll need resources to travel. So poor gay couples might be shut out from marriage if Obergell is overturned. And if you're in this predicament, you need to pay really close attention to the news this fall, because you may want to get married earlier rather than later if you're in a committed relationship, because you might lose that chance in your state if they do what we're expecting them to do, assuming they take up this case. And odds are Republican attorneys general are going to try to punish couples that get married out of state, which could trigger a whole new legal challenge that leads to the Respect for Marriage Act making its way through the system and ultimately getting overturned by the Supreme Court as well. Now, if that were to happen, then we're talking about the worst case scenario where marriages would be invalidated in red states. That would be awful. That's only if the Respect for Marriage Act is repealed or struck down after the Supreme Court strikes down Obergell v. Hodges. So we're talking worst of the worst case scenario. And if that happens, it would take us back to the disastrous pre-Obergell status quo. But it would be worse these days because there's a lot more married couples now than there were before Obergell. So before Obergell, there was only about 232,000 gay couples, but now there's more than 823,000, and 1 in 5 of these couples have children, according to a statistic ABC News cited by the UCLA. And there's more than 1,000 federal and state benefits that come with marriage. So among queer couples, this would create this patchwork where there's variation in marriage equality, where the advantages and statuses of same-sex marriage would vary greatly depending on which state you're living in. Now, again, this is the worst-case scenario that only comes to fruition if the Supreme Court decides to overturn Obergell, and then the Respect for Marriage Act falls as well. But I think that if Obergell is overturned, it is very likely that the Respect for Marriage Act falls next. Obergell is kind of a domino that could set off that potential legal scenario, and we need to be prepared for that possibility. As Gabrielle Perry put it, get copies of birth certificates and custody for your children on paper. Make sure life insurance policies, property that you own, bank account information, passwords for things, powers of attorney, etc. are all set up and understood. In other words, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. There's also the question of healthcare. A lot of gay couples receive healthcare through their spouse's employer, and they would likely lose that if their marriage was invalidated. So we're talking about returning to a very, very, very dark time in American history where same-sex couples were treated as second-class citizens. And that is so sad to me, and thinking about it honestly makes me feel a little bit emotional because, look, as a gay man myself who's been married for 8 years, I've been with my husband for nearly 15 years, I'm going to be in my 40s in a couple of years, and by then I would have thought that society would have all moved on to the point where this was a settled issue and we wouldn't even have to think about this. But that's simply not the case, unfortunately. Christian nationalist fascists have taken over the fucking country, and the progressive future that looked inevitable in the 2010s might have just been a mirage. I don't know what the future has in store for any of us, but what I do know is that all of our rights are under attack, and if we lose them, it's going to be so much harder to get them back. So pay very close attention to what happens, because this is a pivotal moment in history.
Mom, I'm gay. Gays. Mom, I'm transgender.